There are a lot of ways that a translator can negatively impact the translation process based on what they bring mentally to the process. There are a bunch of different types of unconscious bias. You can be biased in your source language. If you're more, especially if you're more familiar with the source language than the target language, you can tend toward formulation and syntax that is more in line with the source language, even when you're rendering it into the target language. In the same way, if you are more familiar with the target language, you can read cultural mores and um, grammatical formations in your source language that aren't necessarily there just because you're expecting them based on your familiarity with the target language. Um, a lot of bias is unconscious. You can think that this is what's most appropriate, but if it's just what you're more familiar with, it may not necessarily be what is appropriate for the situation. And the last form of unconscious bias is lack of familiarity with the translation process. So if you are just familiar with the languages but not really aware of transfer or message or trying to convey the message but not necessarily the words, then you're going to end up with a word for word translation that doesn't necessarily convey the accurate meaning from the source language. So the three types of relationships between idea units are temporal, spatial, and logical. So temporal can be means time. So if you're going to want to organize idea units in the order in which they occurred, that can be a way that you can organize idea units. Spatial is, again, relationships, so where two different objects are in relationship to each other in space. And the third one is logical. So the cause comes before the effect, the condition comes um, before the consequence, etc. You want to set up the basis and then the logistics of it. So, visualization plays an important role in transfer because it helps you to pull away from focusing on the words and the word choice, because word for word translation is an inaccurate translation most times. Visualization helps you to see what is being described, and then because you are detached from the words of the source language text, you can describe again the same thing but in a way that fits more with the target language. So it's just a way to kind of distance from word choice and syntax that may get you caught up in source language form. There are three approaches to translating idioms. They are idiom to idiom, idiom to non idiom, and not idiom to idiom. So, idiom to idiom is when there's a saying in the source language and a saying in the target language, and they are equivalent. So, for instance, if you had in ASL, an equivalent idiom in English would be, it slipped my mind. They mean the same thing. Both of them are not necessarily are more than the words involved. So they're both idioms and they have equivalent meanings. So you can do idiom to idiom. An idiom to non-idiom would be like in ASL, there's not really an English equivalent of that. There are things like, screw it, screw that. But again, how you phrase that is going to depend on context in English, whereas this is a lot more versatile in ASL. So it's not going to be quite equivalent, and you're going to have to come up with something like screw it or screw that, which isn't necessarily an idiom in English. And the third one is non-idiom to idiom. So if you started with that's not funny in English, then you could turn it into in ASL. There's idiom to non-idiom to idiom is when there's a whole phrase in the source language that can be condensed into a culturally significant idiom in the target language. So reformulation, number 5. Reformulation requires a lot of background knowledge because if you're going to reformulate a text and make sure that the meaning and the impact are equivalent, then you have to understand the meaning and the impact of the source text. So that includes understanding the author's intent, what the author is trying to say with the source text, why they're using the words they're using, cultural mores, and syntactic choices that affect the message are important. Because reformulation necessarily ends up leaving out some information just because, again, not everything translates, your ELK and your familiarity with the source language and the target language is going to help you figure out what absolutely positively needs to be in the target text translation and what is maybe superfluous. So reformulation is taking a message post-analysis, once you understand it, and turning it into something equivalent in another language. So reformulation is changing the syntax and the word choice to be more in line with the uses of the target language, whereas analysis is a step that comes before that, where you first have to make sure you understand the message in the source language text. If you don't understand the message in the source language text, nothing you do from that point on is going to be accurate, because you're going to have to reformulate and because you're going to have to you're going to have to focus on meaning rather than word choice. So if you don't understand the meaning, nothing from that point on is going to work. So analysis helps with understanding the meaning. Reformulation helps with staying true to form in the target language. So illocutionary force is the author's intent, why they are writing or speaking this message, why they are writing it or speaking it the way that they are. So this can be boiled down. This is things like persuasive, inflammatory, interrogatory, etc. Like what is the point of what they're saying. Illocutionary force is really important to understand because you have to match that in the target language message. So understanding why they're choosing to phrase it the way that they are is really important to choosing phrasing in the target language. You don't necessarily have to keep the exact same form. So just because something is phrased as a question doesn't mean it's necessarily interrogatory. It could be, ASL uses rhetorical questions a lot more frequently than English does. And so translating a rhetorical question from ASL into English doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be phrased as a question in English. But the meaning has to be there, and you have to understand why it was phrased as a question in the first place. Because not all questions are rhetorical. So to sum up, basically, illocutionary force maintains meaning over form, is the point of illocutionary force. So dynamic equivalence versus formal correspondence is two different ways to think about matching the tone and meaning of a message from one language into the other. So dynamic equivalence is all about the impact on the audience. If you have dynamic equivalence, then the source language message and the target language message have an equal impact on their target audiences. Formal correspondence, on the other hand, is equal form. So it's matching the syntax and grammar and word choice of the source language in the target language. The issue with formal correspondence is that a lot of times when you do that it ends up not making sense in the target language, that you have to languages vary in the way that they organize information, and so trying to match that organization is going to actually make it make less sense in the target language. So dynamic equivalence works better because it focuses more on the meaning behind the words rather than the words themselves. So the three priorities of dynamic equivalence are efficiency in the source language, the target language, and in transfer skills. So you are not going to be able to achieve dynamic equivalence unless you understand the original message in the source language. Because if you don't understand the message, then you're not going to be able to maintain the message. That's the whole point. If you don't understand the target language, even if you understand the message in the source language, you're not going to be able to render an equivalent because you don't have the necessary language skills to create the same message. And transfer is important because if you don't have the proper transfer skills, then it's going to get lost. The message is going to get lost. You have to break away. If you're unable to break away from wording, if you are unable to break away from a word for word translation, if you get caught up in the word choice or the syntax of the source language in the transfer phase, then what comes out in the target language is going to be, it is not going to be equivalent. So thinking about audience needs, there are a lot of ways that who your audience is will impact how you translate something. So thinking about audience age, sex, race, education, ELK, linguistic needs, etc., is going to impact your word choice, your register. Is it formal? Is it informal? Do they have the necessary ELK to understand this technical jargon? Is there a lot going on? Do you need to condense it, or is there a time crunch? So knowing your audience is going to affect how you translate a message. So it's very important to know the audience. And if your audience is a very diverse group of people, then you need to kind of shoot for center. You don't want to be so technical that 99% of people don't know what you're talking about, but you also don't want to be so basic that this half over here is bored to tears. So if you have experts and beginners, you want to kind of shoot for an intermediate level. So knowing your audience needs, knowing the age, sex, education, ELK, linguistic needs of your audience is going to affect the register of your translation.